Okay guys, Timmy coming at you here, and today what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the parts of the brain. So one of the things that you should be aware of is just the basic function of each part. And the reason I say that is if somebody has a head injury or they suffer a stroke, if you understand the basic parts of the brain, then you can figure out what area of the brain they've suffered an injury. So what I want to do is I want to first start out by going over the lower portions of the brain. Now again, the nervous system controls the minute to second changes that occur in the body, right? In an attempt to maintain homeostasis. And as you move from the lower parts of the brainstem, so the spinal cord is connected to the brainstem, as you move from the lower parts of the brainstem to the upper parts, the cerebral cortex, the functions become much more complex. So the lower portions of the brainstem are involved in your basic biological functions. So let's go over that real quick. Right? So let's start with the medulla, right? We know about the medulla. The medulla is involved in controlling breathing, right? It's got little chemoreceptors that detect increases in carbon dioxide levels in arterial blood, and that will stimulate breathing. But the medulla also controls blood pressure and heart rate as well. And when you get in to more detailed sections on the brain, I'll explain to you why. The medulla also controls something that's fun, and that's vomiting. It controls the vomit reflex. So that's the basic function of the medulla. Now, as you move up a little farther, you get into the area called the pons. Now, the pons is also involved in breathing. Basically what the pons does is make sure that you don't overinflate your lungs, otherwise they'll explode and there could be a mess. So the pons controls how deep an inspiration you can take. Also, it has an area called the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is involved in your sleep-wake cycle. So it tells you to go to bed, and then it tells you to wake up. That's why if you work third shift, it's very difficult to sleep when it's light out. That's why you need to have that room as dark as possible. Now, the pons also, when you fall asleep and you go into that REM sleep, that restorative sleep, it will partially paralyze your skeletal muscle. That's why when you think a monster is chasing you, it feels like you're running in quicksand. That's because there's a disconnect between the brain and what your muscles are actually capable of. Like in your mind, you think you're running, but your body isn't moving. So people who sleepwalk, there's a disconnect, meaning that they will actually act out their dreams. The pons doesn't partially paralyze those skeletal muscles. Then you get to the hypothalamus. Well, we all know what the hypothalamus is involved in, right? The hypothalamus is involved in controlling hunger, temperature, and thirst. And I'm going to make a very rudimentary drawing here, very rudimentary. So here you got the H-thal, right? And then connected to the H-thal is a gland called the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, under the effects of the hypothalamus, will release particular hormones that will affect different organs of the body. And as you matriculate through your program, I'll explain in a little more detail just how that works. Then you get to the thalamus. The thalamus is an area of the brain where it's kind of like the gatekeeper. So the thalamus kind of controls what sensory input goes to the higher brain levels and determine what becomes conscious to you. Let me give you an example. If you're at a party, 200 people, you know how the voices are, blah, 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 right? But if you hear your name, you're always going to attend to that because the hypothalamus says, look, that's important to me. All this other gibberish that's going on, that's not important. Another thing, you're driving in your car, and you will always recognize the same make and model of car that you're driving because you assume that that person must be cool too. Now, the opposite is true. Like, for example, what I'm talking about right now, the thalamus is saying, look, that's not important. I got to update my Facebook status. That's this way. I'll just put one mark there for, that's one. That's one little mark there for Timmy being a wise acre, or something that also starts with an A. But again, I digress. So again, the thalamus is involved in monitoring and determining what sensory input that's coming from your body is going to become conscious to you. Now, you got the cerebellum. The cerebellum is referred to as the little brain. And the cerebellum is involved in fine-tuning muscular movement. So it allows you to have fluid, coordinated movement. Damage to the cerebellum results in problems with walking, running, and generalized movement. Then you have the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain. So it allows information from each hemisphere to be transferred. So here's something that I'd like you to understand just at a basic level. You got your right and left hemispheres of the brain, and the body is contralaterally innervated, meaning that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So again, if people lose function, movement, the ability to move their arm or leg on their left side, then you know that the stroke occurred in the right side of the brain. And each hemisphere of the brain has some specific qualities that are unique to that hemisphere. And again, I don't want you to understand, I don't want you to be able to list all this stuff, but understand that like creativity, imagination, intuition, insight, right, music awareness, and left-handed control all come from the right side of the brain. So if you happen to be left-handed, then you are referred to as being right brain dominant. And people who are left-handed, on average, tend to be more creative and insightful than people who are right-handed. So again, the left brain controls the right side. So if you are right-handed, that means you are left brain dominant. So you are more analytical, reasoning, you're better in science and math. But again, most of the students that I deal with, they must be left-handed because, boy, they don't like math. Yep. Anyways, I digress. So this is more the analytical side, where this is more of the right side is more of the creative side. The left side of the brain is more of the analytic side. And all I wanted you to really understand is that the right side of the brain controls the left side. The left side of the brain controls the right side. Now, as you start moving up into the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, this is a new part of the brain, right? So humans have a pretty well-developed cerebral cortex. So I just want to go over some of the major functions of each lobe of the brain. Now, the frontal lobe here. The frontal lobe is really kind of the seat of our humanity. This is what allows us to know that we are conscious. We have the ability to problem solve. It's also some of our emotional traits that are involved. And more importantly, it's reasoning and judgment, the ability to determine what is right and what is wrong. Also, the primary motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe, and this is what initiates movement, and then it is further, work done by the cerebellum to provide that smooth, coordinated movement. Like, you should, if you see me swing my golf club, it's clear, clear that I've been doing it for a while because it is so fluid and effortless, and I'm killing it, just so you know. Anyways, also this area is, the frontal lobe is involved in speech and the initiation of speech. So if someone develops a stroke in the frontal lobe, it can affect their speech. Then you go now to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, right? The temporal lobe is involved in understanding language, right? So initiating speech is the frontal lobe. Understanding the language is the job of the temporal lobe. And then also there's some behavior components to the temporal lobe. And this is where a lot of short-term memory is stored. And it's the area for interpreting what you hear. We talked about the brainstem, and then we also talked about the cerebellum. It's involved in balance and coordination and that fine motor control. And now if you look at the occipital lobe, that's involved in vision and interpreting what you see. So the occipital lobe is involved in vision and then perceiving colors as well. And then you have the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe is involved in sensation. So this is the primary cortex for touch and pressure sensation. Also, it's involved in reading, the ability to read, and knowing right from left, being able to distinguish that, and also knowing where your body is in space, right? Are you upside down? Are you spinning, right? Are you laying down? So those are some of the major functions of the lobes of the brain. And I hope that helped.